Good evening and welcome to our session. It's our last one on grief, reintegration, and job search. And this was a session I think I've been looking forward to doing for a long time now because there's such a tie between the grief you're feeling as part of reintegration and then the added trauma and grief of trying to search for a job that I really wanted to give you some perspective on that and to help you understand what's going on for yourself. So the agenda this evening is looking at grief and understanding what that looks like, because for some of you, you might not have ever lost somebody, so you might not have gone through that process of grief before, so this will be a new experience for you. We're going to look at some information about reintegration and how people adapt to the reintegration, talk a bit about job search and how that works and how we wished it worked, and then look at how you take care of yourself through this process. So let's first sort of discuss just what grief is. So grief can be defined as a deep or poignant distress caused by a bereavement, so the loss of a person, but it can also be a loss of a place, or it can be a loss of a thing, and it can be a cause of suffering. Or it can be an unfortunate outcome. And sometimes, especially if you were like me and you worked in the Caribbean where they use language in a more traditional sense, grief is an annoying or playful criticism. So people would often say, I would hear people say, oh, you're griefing me. Like they'd make it a verb. And it was sort of like you're bugging me, right? So we're more going to talk about grief in terms of this poignant distress that you feel when things don't go as you were hoping or when you're feeling a loss. And so we kind of hope that how grief works is that there's an incident where it starts, so in our case that might be leaving the country that we were volunteering in, and then we work through it and then it ends at some point. But this is more what it looks like. So the reality of grief looks a lot more like this. Grief is really messy. It doesn't always follow a linear line. You can be doing really well with loss one day and not well at all the next day. And it takes a long time to work through those emotions. And especially if you're not dealing with those emotions, especially if you're not really bringing them to the front of your mind and letting yourself experience what you're experiencing. A lot of us especially in Western society, are taught to sort of repress our emotions and not to show them because they're a sign of weakness. So it all acts as a barrier to being able to move forward and reintegrate with our lives. So in the late 60s, a Swiss psychologist named Elizabeth Kubler-Ross realized that in schools they weren't teaching enough about how to help people who were going through this grieving process. And she designed a model that holds to this day in terms of how we deal with loss and how we deal with grief. So the initial stage is shock and denial. So for us as return volunteers, what that looks like is sometimes avoidance. I knew somebody who they were just avoiding getting an apartment when they came back to Canada because it was sort of like, well, it wasn't going to happen. I'm like, you're homeless. You need to get an apartment. But it was that I know I'm going to be losing something and I don't want to deal with it. And so um, it can look like a lot of things for a lot of people, but there's this notion of trying to avoid what's actually happening, not preparing for it. And when we get into the more talking about reintegration, you'll see that that's one of the things that slows down the process of an effective reintegration. So then there's this notion of anger and frustration, irritation, anxiety. And so you might find that that's where you're at, and we do tend to get frustrated with the life that we've come back to, because the life that we had all these elements that we really loved, and we felt maybe like we were living our true self. And so now there's anger and frustration around, why can't I have that level of responsibility and that level of um, friendships here, um, and it leads. It's just part of that grieving process. And then there's depression and detachment. And so feeling overwhelmed, feeling the blahs, a lack of energy, feeling helpless, that's all perfectly normal. So I know some of you have been telling me about, about having those feelings, and that's perfectly normal. So the good news is if that's where you are right now, you then start to move your way up and out of this grieving process. And so by the way you do that is through dialogue. And so reaching out to others, telling your story, which you guys have been sharing with me, and trying to make some meaning about what that journey meant for you. And so I think this is where job search really integrates into the grieving process, is because the job search process is really your way of helping you to make a meaning out of what you just accomplished. So the by engaging in the job search process, you're actually moving yourself along out of this grief cycle. And then acceptance is the next stage, and that's where you make a new plan, right? And so for you guys, this is going to be your new plan is going to be your new job, your new city for some of you. So that's your new thing, and you're letting go of the past and what you lost, and you're latching on to this new thing. And then returning to a meaningful life, empowerment, security, self-esteem, and meaning. And you'll find that you make those things again, just like you did when you went in country and you had to, gain your security and your self-esteem and create the meaning, you'll find that you do that in Canada as well. I really like this tier model of grief in terms of what you need to do, because Kubler-Ross is great. Love Kubler-Ross for intellectually understanding what's going on. I'm at this particular place, I'm in bargaining, and I need to get over here. But how? It's just like, that's fantastic. I now understand where I am, but how do you get from one level to the next level? So I like this model that's called TIER. And the first thing you need to do is to accept the reality of the loss, experience the pain of the loss, adjust to the new environment, and reinvest in the new reality. So let's look at what that means in concrete terms. So one of the things that you need to do in order to sort of come to terms with that loss is to think about what you actually did lose. So let's sort of look at this list and go over what it was you might have lost. So perhaps you lost a sense of adventure. I know when I was in Grenada, everything was an adventure. Going to the market was an adventure. Getting on the minibus was an adventure. We did something called hashes where we would go hiking up all through the island, and it was always a sense of adventure. And then you come back to Canada and there's no sense of adventure. It's like, meh, the TTC kind of runs on time, or OC Transpo runs on time. There's no sort of, I need to catch the bus. It could be any time of day. It's very regulated in Canada. So you may feel that you've lost that sense of adventure. Your health, we tend to walk a lot when we're in any of the countries that we're placed in. The transportation is not as reliable, and so we're doing a lot of walking. You may have felt that you lost the challenge that you were feeling in country, where you're being pushed to do really difficult or ambitious work, and you're not being challenged in that way in Canada. You may feel that you lost the closeness that you had with people, your sense of passion. So if you're somebody who studied international development or was working in a field that was very aligned with who you are as a person, you may feel that you lost that passion when you left the country that you were in. You might feel that you lost your usefulness. You're, especially if you're not employed right now, it's like, well, I was so useful there, and here I don't feel useful at all. And that's a really hard one to come to terms with. You may have lost the climate, and most of us would have been in countries that are quite warm. And so coming back to Canada, we have to adapt to a climate that's always changing, and that's a loss. Like, there was something really nice about going out every single day and knowing exactly what the temperature was going to be. The weather network did not exist for me while I lived in Grenada, because it was going to be hot and it was going to rain. those two things were guaranteed. And so you just brought an umbrella. Where in Canada, you're constantly having to check, like, is it going to be rain? Is it going to be a really bad rain? Is it going to be sunny? What's the UV index? We just, most of us wouldn't have had to do that in our countries. So we've lost that. Our sense of accomplishment, of getting something done, of um, of being accomplished, we lose when we come home. You might have actually lost your home. I was in Grenada for 10 months and we had a home. Our home was in Belmont, and I knew where my home was, and people knew where my home was, and it felt like our home. So you actually lose a physical space as well. You might have lost connections to community, to people. Your identity gets really shaken when you come back home because you had an identity there. And my identity in Grenada was very different than my identity here. In Grenada, I was Miss Sarah because everybody is very formal, and I couldn't quite get used to the Mrs. Rylot. That just didn't feel right to me, so I was Miss Sarah. But I'm not Miss Sarah in Canada, I'm just Sarah in Canada. So we lose our identity, and how we were perceived there is very different than how we're perceived here. Friendships, you'll maybe not have lost them, but you won't have those close friendships that you would have had every day. And you most likely lived in a community with people, and that community would have been a big part of your life when you were in country, and you've lost your community. And you might also feel like you've lost your sense of purpose now that you're back in Canada. So it's really important to think through all the things that you've lost. And I have a picture of my husband in our Honda CRV because we're just looking to buy a vehicle right now because we need to. And I keep saying, I want a CRV. I want like the CRV we drove in Grenada because I loved it. It was like the best little car ever. And of course, they don't make them here the same way they do there, and it's all kinds of things. But it's like we lose little things. Sometimes it's little things that we've lost. I still, 2 years later, I still sometimes if I'm driving out on a road where I've made a turn onto a road and there's no lines, I'm like, what side of the road am I supposed to be driving on? Because I still have that sense of driving um, on the left instead of driving on the right. So we lose a lot of things when we transition from our host country back into our home country. So thinking through that helps you with the grieving process, because if you don't know what you're grieving, it makes it really hard to move past it. So I wanted to highlight some of the things that make the transition back into your home country a little bit harder. And it's based on the research that was done for a master's thesis in 2016 by a young woman in New Zealand. And so these are some of the findings that she had coming out of her study. And the first was that females experience more distress when they're coming back. And there definitely seemed to be a gender issue along with reintegration. And the younger you are, the harder it is to integrate. So this is largely because your friend group will have shifted. So, and depending how long you were gone, your friend group might shift significantly. So if you just graduated university and all your friends went off to jobs, and then you go off to another country and you come back, they're all in different places where you were used to having them all in one spot, which was at the university campus. So tends to be the younger you are, the harder it is to reintegrate. The older you are, like me, where I had an established job, my husband had an established job, my kids had established schools, it wasn't as hard for us to reintegrate because everything was already established for us. People who are single find it more difficult than people who are couples. So if you went as a couple, you would probably find it easier to come back just because you already had that built-in support system. That person has already experienced the same things you've experienced, and they're currently experiencing those same things. The less you traveled previously, the more difficult the return. So if the first time you had ever gone out of the country was to go on a placement, you're going to find it very difficult to return. Whereas if your family were travelers and traveled not not so much like for a vacation. So a 1 week vacation, I mean, that counts as travel for sure. But if you'd spent 2 or 3 weeks somewhere with your family previously, you tend to reintegrate better just because you've had the experience of being away for a little while. The more you identify with the people from your host country, the harder it is to return. So the more connected you felt to that country, the harder it is to come back to your home country. And then not planning or thinking about how coming home might be hard. So a lot of people in our study just didn't think about what that would be like to come back home after time away. And for her study, people were away for between 12 months and 10 years. And the less she thought about coming home and planning the coming home, not just like thinking, oh yeah, I'm going to be coming home, but what does that look like? I need an apartment. I need to hook up, hydro, all those kind of things. The the harder it was for them to reintegrate. And then not arriving back to something significant. So not arriving back to a job or a traditional holiday or the start of a school semester made it a lot more difficult because you just sort of get plunked into the middle of everything moving along as it always does. And I know for us, we plan to come back on June the 30th because I didn't want to miss Canada Day. In Canada, I've never missed one and I never want to miss one. And that made it really helpful because there was already a party. I came home and it was the very next morning I got up and there's a party going on because it's Canada Day. So arriving to something significant is really a helpful predictor of reintegrating well. When you arrive back and you don't have anything, it can be more difficult to reintegrate. One of the things I found really, I don't know if I want to say useful, but more just comforting was that um, the master's thesis had a lot of stories in it, which I found really useful. And basically, they were all saying the same thing that, being away was this wonderful experience and coming home was really hard. And that, going away seemed easier because there was this excitement about being somewhere new, where coming home felt like a letdown. And even if you were wanting to come home, it still felt like not necessarily a failure, but just that you were acknowledging that you had to land back where you were from. And so I really liked some of these quotes from the both a study in 1981 and also the 2016 master's thesis about how hard it is to come back. And so I sort of wanted you to read this so that you could give yourself permission to feel the way you're feeling because it is really normal and it is hard to come back home. So in the tier model, the next thing that we need to do in order to move out of our grief is to adjust to the new environment. So it is perfectly normal, as you've seen, to feel out of sync with your home culture. You've experienced another culture that has different ways of doing things, and now you need to readjust to being back in your home culture. And this can take anywhere between 12 to 18 months, and it can take less, but don't be surprised if it takes 12 to 18 months. So give yourself permission to take time to readjust to this new environment. And creating links to concrete events will help you. So making plans for things like Canada Day or getting a job, having an apartment, all of those things will help you to adjust to your new environment because you're starting to lay down the foundation of a life where before you were sort of living in limbo when you're in country because you know this isn't going to be your permanent life. But now you've come back and you probably might feel like you don't want this to be your permanent life either. But in order to adjust, you have to start to take some concrete steps to tie yourself back to your home country. Or if you're going to be going off again, then to start making those plans to volunteer again or to work internationally. But in order to adjust to the new environment, you need to take concrete steps to link yourself back into that community that you're going to be living in. So then the last thing we need to do is we need to reinvest in the new reality. So some of the ways we can do that is we can set some goals around having a job, having an apartment, um, being part of our community. We can embrace what we can. So what are some of the things that we really love about Canada? I mean, there's just so much to love about here, right? And there's so much that we can embrace about what's here. And there's things that are, we're certainly not a perfect country, but we can certainly embrace a lot of the things that probably made us want to volunteer internationally in the first place. We can connect with those things and we can reinvest in them. And then making meaning and making connections. So finding ways to take what you've learned from your volunteer experience, make the meaning out of it, and then find the connections. So are there connections that you can make? Um, I know that one of you were trying to make those connections up into the Canadian North in terms of how we do development work, and that there's development work here, or that, if you're in Toronto, where you can continue to work with the Latin American community, even though you're in Toronto. So there's lots of connections that we can make, and we can reinvest our efforts into this new reality, which is we are home and we do love our country. I can't imagine any Canadian who doesn't love being Canadian. So we just have to make the most of that and to really throw ourselves into investing in what we can do here, and that we can do as much good here as we did in our overseas placement. So now let's move on to talking a little bit how job search links into all of this. So as you're doing a job search, you sort of have this hope, and I know this isn't the real way it goes, but you've got this hope that it's this, I start looking for a job and then I find a job, and it's going to be that linear. But of course it looks more like this. So most of you already realize this, but this is how job search really looks, right? It's a series of stops and starts. It's a lot of sending things out and a lot of not hearing back. And I think for a lot of us, that's the hard part, is if we knew that we weren't successful, it's like, oh, okay, well, I wasn't successful. But a lot of times it just lingers on and you don't know, are they still pursuing that job? Are they not pursuing that job? And then sometimes, and oftentimes, you'll have applied to something, you'll sort of shut the door on that, and then all of a sudden you hear back from them, and it's like, oh yeah, we want to interview you, and you're thinking, but that was months ago, and I don't remember what was going on, or recruiters found your resume and they don't want to interview you for the job that you applied for, but for a different job. So job search is kind of messy in a different way than grief is messy, but it's a different kind of stress because you're constantly putting yourself out there, and most of the time you're being rejected, whether it's formally or informally, and that's really hard on your psyche. So if we look at the type of loss that you feel in a job search, you're going to notice that it's almost identical to the type of loss you felt when you came back to Canada in terms of what you were missing. So we miss closeness, and we miss connection when we're job searching because often it's an isolated activity. Um, your friendships tend to suffer when you're in job search mode because they may be employed and they're in a different stage in their life, so they can't meet up with you for coffee because they're working, or they're too tired after work to come and do stuff with you. Um, you may feel a lack of passion because you're there's not a lot of joy in job search. This sense of a lack of purpose, as you start to apply for things and the thing that you really want isn't available, so now you're just applying to whatever's available. So you start to lack that sense of purpose. Your health tends to suffer in job search. The longer you're in job search, studies have shown the less healthy you eat, the less you tend to go to the gym and do all those kind of healthy activities. So the same kind of losses that you have in reintegration you have in job search, and so now they're compounding each other, right? Because you've got it on the one hand with your reintegration, and now you're experiencing it again in a separate way with your job search. So it's really important that we think through how we're going to get out of this sense of loss. So of the things that you lose when you reintegrate and when you're job searching, probably the most important thing is this sense of loss of identity. And I've been working now for at least 11 years in careers. And the thing that is so challenging for most people who are facing a job loss is this sense of identity that's tied to their job. And in our Western world, we are so tied to the notion that we have to have a career and a job isn't really good enough, and people who have jobs, aren't high achievers, and that there's more to life than a job, and that's a career, and we have to have these spectacular careers. You look at the Mark Zuckerbergs, and it's like somehow we're all expected to be in our 30s running a $1 billion company, or the kids who did Me to We, and it's like, yeah, you're all supposed to have started at 8 years old and become these really important, significant people. And the reality is that it's okay to have a job, and it's okay to have your identity not be tied to your job. In fact, it's probably healthier not to have your identity tied to a job, because that way, when you experience job loss, your fundamental sense of identity doesn't get lost in the transition. And that's what happens to so many people that I work with, where they come to me and their whole life they feel like is slipping away from them because they're losing their job or their career, and they hadn't realized how much weight they had put on that particular part of their identity. And so, as you come back from an in-country experience and a volunteer experience, you created a sense of identity there, and you do it really quickly. And then when you come back to Canada, you've lost that identity, but you don't have a typical Canadian identity either. You don't have a job, which is what we all identify with here. And so you get really out of sync with this culture. And the creation of an identity outside of work and outside of job is going to be really critical for you as a human being for the rest of your life. So if you can sort of get this now, where you create a sense of identity that isn't tied to your job, you'll find that you have a more stable sense of identity throughout your career. So finding that sense of identity, and it's just being able to say, who am I outside of work? So and outside of other people, because oftentimes people, when I challenge them to, well, who are you? Well, I'm a father, or I'm a mother, or I'm a spouse. Well, that's all tied to somebody else. What is your own identity outside of other people? And and it is probably one of the hardest things for people to articulate themselves independently of other people. So we're going to look at some ways that you can reclaim your identity, and really start to think about, who am I? What is my purpose that isn't tied to another person and that isn't tied necessarily to work? One of the first things you can do to reclaim your identity is to start to think about how you characterize yourself. And so, like I said before, oftentimes we characterize ourselves in relations to others, and it can be really challenging to separate ourselves out from that identity that gets created by the connections that we have with other people. But in order to have a solid identity, you need to have an identity that's linked to only yourself. So I'll hear people say, well, I'm an advocate. Well, but that's still linked to other people, right? You have to advocate. You can advocate for yourself, but generally speaking, you advocate for other people. Or I'm a helper, still in relation to other people. So something that might be just for you is, you could be kind, you could be intelligent, you could be reflective, you could be creative. All of those things are just for you. You can use them with other people, but they reside solely within yourself. And that builds a more solid base when you're not constantly trying to connect your identity to other people. And oftentimes when you connect your identity to other people, you have to be different things for other people, right? So as a daughter, you might have to be a slightly different person than you would normally be when you're with your friends, right? So what we're looking for here is an identity that is truly yours, that's the foundation on which all these other identities that you'll have in your life are based on. But when you have that solid sense of self, it doesn't get shaken as much when you go from one experience to the next experience, or when you're unemployed or when you're employed. It doesn't matter, because you have that foundation. The next thing you can do to reclaim your identity is go to new places. So doing the same things that you always did are only going to get you the same results that you've always had. So you need to push yourself to be the person that you want to be. Needs to be fulfilled and needs to be fed in terms of your who you are and whether you see that as your soul or as your essence. But you need to feed that by doing different things and going to new places and meeting new people who can help you to develop this sense of identity. But if you stick with the same group of people, your identity is going to very quickly get wrapped around that same type of identity that you had before, which if you're finding it stressful, the reintegration and the job search, it isn't serving you well. So find new places, find new people. And then the last thing you can do is catch any negative thinking and replace it with facts. So one of the things that I would normally talk about in when I do leadership courses is cognitive distortions, which is a really fancy term, but it basically means you look at something and the way you see it isn't true, or you've distorted it. There's a grain of truth in it, but you've distorted it. So as an example, you send out 20 resumes and you hear nothing back. So then you think, oh, I must be really bad at this. Instead of replacing that negative thought with, I sent out 20 resumes. There's no judgment about it. You don't need to characterize what happened. You did your job, somebody else is doing their job. You don't judge, you would never go into somebody's workplace and judge how they were doing their job. That would just never occur to you. But yet when you have that negative thought about, well, I must not be good enough, well, why? Why would you have that thought? That's not a rational thought. So it's to catch yourself in these negative thought processes and replace it with just simply facts. And sometimes it works to keep a journal of what's going on with that negative thinking so that you can catch it and reframe it and really look at how is that negative thought serving you. But we tend to live in a world where the negative is pervasive, right? So the news is full of negative things. And so that starts to become our frame of reference for our own thinking, but it doesn't have to be. We can remove that. And when I say, I want you to remove that, I don't say replace it with positive thinking, right? Because I don't think that it's necessarily right to say I've sent out 20 resumes and I'm going to hear back from every one of them. Like we're not wishful thinking these thoughts away. What we're doing is that we're just replacing it with facts. So I've sent out 20 resumes and that's where it ends, right? So be conscious of, like, you don't have to replace that negative thought with a positive one. You just have to replace it with facts. So the last tool I wanted to show you was what's called the mental health continuum model. And this is a model that we use in national defense to help managers and to help employees understand what mental health looks like and what mental illness looks like, because mental illness and mental health are on a continuum. And so we see green is healthy, yellow is reacting, orange is injured, and red is ill. And so what I really like about this model is that it gives us behaviors and then it gives us actions. So when you're healthy, you have normal fluctuations in your mood. I mean, everybody has good days and bad days. This is not, you're not ill or injured or reacting if you're having fluctuations in your mood. That's just normal. You've got normal sleep patterns. You're feeling physically well. You have consistent performance. So you're able to, if you're job searching, you're able to consistently put effort into that. And you're socially active. Where you might be reacting is where there's nervousness, irritability, sadness. You're having trouble sleeping. You're tired. You have lower energy. You have issues with procrastination. And you decrease your social activity. So that's when we start to say, well, that person isn't as well as they were. And so we want to make sure that they're taking actions to move back into doing better. So in that case, if you're in the reacting, if that sounds like where you are, you would look at recognizing your limits. So maybe you need to put a limit on some of your activities, getting adequate rest, food, and exercise, engaging in healthy coping strategies, and identifying and minimizing stressors. And then for people who are injured in their mental health, they're feeling anxious, angry, they have pervasive sadness and feelings of hopelessness, they're not sleeping well, there's fatigue, there's aches and pains, decreased performance. Presenteeism just means you show up for work, but you're really not there, you're not checked in, you're just going through the motions. And social avoidance or withdrawal. And then if that's you, then you would want to identify and understand your own signs of distress. So, can you see that you're not doing as well as when you were healthy? talking to somebody, getting help, and seeking social support instead of withdrawing. So sort of pushing yourself to get out and talk to friends and family instead of withdrawing into your own world. And then when someone is red or they're in the ill phase of their mental health, excessive anxiety and easily enraged or depressed, unable to fall asleep or stay asleep, exhaustion, physical illness, so you actually get physically sick, unable to perform or they're absent from work, and isolation and avoiding social events. And if you're on the mental health continuum, if you're ill, you need to seek help and consultation, follow up care with a healthcare provider, and regain physical and mental health. And I think the thing with mental health is that we do move on that continuum on a monthly basis, on a yearly basis, and coming back from a foreign country and also our job search is going to have us sliding along that continuum. And it's really important that you have a knowledge of this baseline of like what's healthy, what's reacting, so that you don't keep moving farther up that continuum, so that you don't go from yellow to orange, that we try and move you back towards green, because it's much easier to move from yellow to green than it is to move from orange to green. So we want you to be thinking about, how am I doing? Am I doing well? Am I not doing well? And if I'm really not doing well, then I need to seek help. And QSO has a EAP program that I think up to 6 months from when you've come back from placement you can access. So making sure that you access, mental health services if you need to is really an important part of moving past, the grief that comes from reintegration, but also from job search, because that's a lot to put on you. It's a lot going on. It's a lot to deal with. And so it's okay if you're not in that healthy stage, but what you want to make sure is that you're taking the necessary steps to move yourself back into healthy, and that you're not engaging in activities that are going to move you farther along the continuum to the right. We want to make sure that you're moving towards the left. All right, so just to wrap up, grief is a normal part of reintegration. It's a normal part of job search. You, you've lost a lot, but you have so much to gain, especially because this is for youth interns. Is the world is sort of stretching out in front of you, and so you're at this wonderful space where you can create your future. And the more time and effort you put into this particular part of moving past your grief, understanding it, reflecting on it, but also creating an identity that is based on your own strengths and not based on things that are going to be transient like jobs and locations, the the better your coping mechanisms will be as things come along in your life, because you were probably aware that it's estimated that you're going to have at least 7 jobs in your lifetime. So you're going to lose jobs, change jobs, move from place to place, and having an identity and having an ability to deal with the grief that comes with loss will serve you well for the rest of your life. And it's something that most people don't think about until they are confronted with a very serious loss or a serious trauma. So I feel like even though it's hard right now and you're kind of in this, and wherever you are on Kubler-Ross's continuum, you're kind of in it, but you have the assurance that you're coming out of it, and that you've got a bunch of supports in place in order to help you come out of it. So always you can get in touch with me via email, and you can check back in with QSO. I'm going to be sending out a questionnaire for you from these sessions, just so that QSO gets a baseline in terms of, was this helpful? Were these 5 sessions helpful to you? And hopefully you can complete that and get the feedback back, so that we can hopefully help more people who are coming back from in-country experiences and make it even better for them, because I have a real sense that all of you are people who want to want to continue on in this field, but also who would want to assist others who are coming back to Canada from their experiences overseas. So great working with you, and I look forward to hearing from you.